Well, I hope you've had your coffee or whatever this morning, because we're going to look at two of our readings, the Old Testament reading from Jeremiah and the Gospel reading from Matthew. They are both really short and to the point, so we may as well look at both. They say different things, but they're not unrelated. Jeremiah is almost funny. I actually laughed when I read it, although it's about a serious situation and not supposed to be funny. God's people had been taken into exile in Babylon, and this passage is an account of a disagreement between two prophets. The first prophet, who's called Hananiah, said that God would break the yoke of the king of Babylon and restore God's people within 2 years. In response to that, Jeremiah said, "Amen." But what he really meant was, well, I'd love that to happen, but unfortunately that's not what God's saying to me. Jeremiah said, "The prophets who preceded you and me from ancient times prophesied war, famine, and pestilence against many countries and great kingdoms. As for the prophet who prophesies peace, when the word of that prophet comes true, then it will be known that the Lord has truly sent the prophet." That was the bit that made me laugh. Jeremiah was right in this case. Hananiah's message of quick restoration didn't come true, and God's people had to live through many years of exile. Jeremiah was known for being a bit miserable and pessimistic, but to be fair, he didn't have a choice as God kept making him give bad news. One writer suggests it would be useful to us if prophets could wear t-shirts saying "true prophet" or "false prophet," so that we would know which was which. But of course this isn't how things work. We have to make a judgment. Prophecy isn't always to do with prediction, so much as speaking into a situation. God sends a prophet to challenge a widely held but harmful view. When people generally are in denial about a situation, God may send a prophet to challenge them to face up to reality. These messages can be hard to hear. The message of a prophet isn't always negative, though. When people are despairing and have lost hope and feel that God has abandoned them, God may send a message of hope and restoration. And, as Jeremiah says, you'll know that one came from God when their message comes true. With some trepidation, I'd like to bring this right up to date. I feel there's a close relationship between protest and prophecy, especially when people are able to articulate and act out a challenge to the way that our society thinks. Now, of course, in the last few weeks, we've really been dealing with the coronavirus crisis, and we continue to do so. But there have been other events. There have been serious protests all over the world, from the Black Lives Matter movement and others. So I'm going to imagine some of the events of the last few weeks in the form of a conversation between two prophets. A prophet, perhaps a preacher who is part of the Black Lives Matter movement, speaks of the need for a wholesale change in attitudes and behaviour towards black people. This is part of God's will for justice for all people. The second prophet says, "But things are so much better these days, and we're all happier, although clearly there's still work to do." Now, you may have noticed that I'm roughly quoting Boris here, but not so much as to get at Boris, but to represent a genuinely held, but rather rosy view of how things are, a view that may be false, it may be in denial of the facts. So then the first prophet could say, like Jeremiah does, "As for the prophet who prophesies peace, when the words of that prophet come true, then it will be known that the Lord has truly sent the prophet." I recognise from my involvement with people with disabilities and also LGBTQ people the frustration that can arise when there is a demand that we should celebrate how far we've come just at the point when we're demanding that we need to be somewhere else. Someone might say, "Tell me to celebrate when things are really put right. Tell me to celebrate when everyone's really equal and everyone is safe on the streets." Protests and prophecy are very much live issues in our house at the moment. It's incredibly interesting, though not always easy, to live with young people who grow into their own identities and opinions. There are some lively discussions and sometimes there are arguments, in spite of an attitude of acceptance. I'm brought back to the passage David spoke about in Matthew last week, Do not think that I have come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Now, my first assumption is that's talking about conflict between people who are Christians and people who are not Christians. But it doesn't have to be. It could just as easily be teenagers and their parents who are bumping up against each other in terms of their identities, and they're working out their views. It could be the work going on in our society of protest and listening and discussion and working out how we live as a society. Jesus talks of the cost of discipleship. Sometimes that cost is to have your attitudes challenged again and again and again. So we come to our couple of verses in Matthew that we heard read today, and I think we come to them now with our heads prepared for what Jesus has to say. I'm going to reword just very slightly without really changing the meaning. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet because they are a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. Whoever receives a righteous person because they are a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones because they are a disciple, none of these will lose their reward. This is not a slightly insipid passage about welcome, and it's definitely not a passage about being subservient. It's mostly a serious challenge to real relationship with those who God brings into our lives. Some are prophets or perhaps protesters who will be wise to listen to carefully and judge whether they really have a message from God. Some are righteous people or people of justice who come alongside us as our fellow disciples, and we will be wise to learn from their way of life. There will be those here described as little ones who need more support, perhaps coming from a place of rejection, who are to be served and also received as disciples. The cup of cold water, literally a cup of cold, represents small acts of service. In practical terms, at this time, during the lockdown in the last few weeks, I hope you've found that there's at least one person who you are walking the road of faith with, be that over the telephone or in messages, or perhaps someone who's in the house with you. Someone who will encourage you and also who can challenge you without causing too much offence. If you don't have that, I hope that you will find it as we slowly return to church. I hope that you have people in your life who are very different from you and perhaps hold different views, but who you can talk with honestly in a spirit of acceptance. If you don't, I hope you will find it in the coming weeks and that you will be challenged and grow in your discipleship and in your relationships with other people. I hope you have found opportunities to serve and be served among fellow disciples. If not, I hope that in time you will find it. I feel that while there are still restrictions on how we can relate to one another, this is a time of strengthening relationships, not weakening them. It is a time of finding ways to support one another in our discipleship that will last beyond the crisis into our future lives. Let us pray. Lord, help us in our life of discipleship. We thank you for those people who come into our lives and those who walk with us on the way. Help us to be discerning in how we think and who we listen to. Change our attitudes where they need to be changed. Strengthen our relationships with our fellow disciples and help us to support those who need it. Amen.